Okay, so why don't we kick off with tonight's material? So it's week 4 of the course, and what we're going to do this week is continue to look at the Buddha's ethical guidelines. So you remember last week we were working through what we call the body and the speech guidelines from the 10 precepts which the Buddha gave, and this week we're going to continue on with that. We're going to look at a bit of home practice and so on, look at the mind precepts this week. The precepts primarily concerned with how we work our minds, what we do with our minds. So let me just share the screen then to show you what we'll be doing. Let me just bring up the slideshow if I can. Oh, just give me 1 second here. Okay. Screen, here we go. Okay, so what we'll be doing tonight then is we'll have a review of the home practice. We'll have a review, well, it says last week, but really it was 2 weeks ago. So we'll have a review of how we got on with that. Then, as I said, we'll move into the mind precepts. So these are the precepts to do with greed, hatred, and delusion primarily, and the cultivation of mindfulness. We'll look a bit in the second half of tonight at commitment to an ideal. So precepts are in a way central to what it means to live an ethical Buddhist life, but you need to also commit to an ideal, a self-transcendent ideal. So we'll come back to that as well. And we'll finish up with that aspect of mindfulness, which is not very well talked about in normal discussions about mindfulness. And that is the discussion around ethical vigilance. So ethical vigilance as an aspect of mindfulness. And we'll look at home practice again and how we'll see if there's any questions to be answered coming out of it. So just to remind you of what we did last time, we did a review of last week as the previous time, as we always do. And we talked about approaching the ethical guidelines. So there was a few dangers to watch out for. It was really heavily emphasized that we're acting like the Buddha. We're not trying to be good. We're not trying to be a martyr. We're trying to avoid spiritual bypassing, where we cut off from aspects of ourselves that we don't like. And the precepts are there to help us become more free, ultimately to help us gain enlightenment. And then we looked at the body precepts and the speech precepts. So let's just remind ourselves of what the body precepts were. So avoiding causing harm. This is the most general precept, and practicing loving kindness. Avoiding abstaining from taking the not given. That should be abstaining from taking the not given, practicing generosity, and not causing harm in our sexual relations, or practicing stillness, simplicity, contentment. And then so they're the body precepts that we talked about. And in terms of the speech precepts, we talked about abstaining from false speech and practicing truthfulness, abstaining from harsh speech and practicing kindly speech, and abstaining from useless speech and practicing meaningful speech. And then the fourth of the speech precepts, abstaining from slanderous speech and practicing harmonizing speech, speech that brings people together instead of taking people apart. So, and the home practice then, it's the same, it's exactly the same home practice tonight as well. So read chapter 4, that's the chapter which was on the precepts, on these guidelines of the Buddha. And look at your practice over the coming weeks. So pick one. You could even pick one that's very relevant each day or for a few days, I was suggesting. And I was also asking you to do one of the reflections on one of the precepts each day. So Subhadramati has quite a few good reflections throughout the book, and picking one each day. And I was also suggesting, as I've done throughout the course, recording how you get on with all these in your notebook. Okay? Okay, great. So a few more people have arrived. Welcome, everyone. So I'm just doing the recap of the last class, which was 2 weeks ago, actually. Okay, so why don't we, how are we doing time-wise? Yeah, so why don't we, we'll be going into groups in a few minutes. So why don't we just do a very short meditation or a very short sit just to arrive. So I'd invite you just to sit comfortably, to sit upright if you can, or if you need to lie down, you can lie down. We'll just do a very brief body scan. So settling into your posture, sitting upright. So relaxing down into the support of your chair or cushions. And at the same time, maintaining an alertness and uprightness. Just tuning into whatever surroundings we're aware of, the sounds, people in our building or in the house with us or beyond. Tuning in then to the body, perhaps starting by noticing our feet in contact with the floor or whatever they're in contact with. Noticing the sitting bones in contact with the chair or cushions. Noticing the contact of our back if it's in contact with the chair. And just letting go into the support that we're sitting on. Maybe take a deeper breath, and on the exhalation, letting go a bit more into that. Become aware of our back and shoulders. Our arms and our hands. Our face, our throat, our jaw. Becoming aware of our stomach and abdomen area. And then resting in the heart area, resting in the chest. For the last few moments, just following the breath in, the breath out. Okay, and then bringing the practice to a close, starting to become aware of the whole of our body again. our surroundings. The sounds we can hear. And then in your own time, opening your eyes, bringing the practice to a close. Okay, so just give me one second. Okay, so in a couple of minutes then I'll ask Tony to send us to the small groups. So a couple of things again, just as I remind you each week about the small groups. So first thing to do is to remember what group number you're in, because if you drop out, we'll need to add you again to the group possibly. So remember what group number you're in. And be quite strict with the timekeeping. So it'd be great if one person in the group could just immediately, if you're a very assertive person, just say, look, I'll do the timing. And you know, what we'll do is we'll aim for groups of 4, and some groups will be a bit bigger, I know, and some groups might end up being a bit smaller. We'll aim for groups of 4, and that'll be 3 minutes each, so there'll be 12 minutes in total. And Tony will send a message every 3 minutes. But if you have a group of 3 or a group of 5, just try and work out, you know, divide 5 into 12. So what's that? Just under 2.5 minutes. So take charge of your own timekeeping so that someone can, to the last person in particular, can get a chance to speak. And what I'd like you to talk about is how you got on with your ethical practice over the week. Did you focus on the guidelines? Did you focus on the guidelines? Did you do some of the exercises that Subhadra Mati mentioned or suggested, and so on? And just how you got on generally. So Daria just said she's on the road, so she can't join the groups. That's okay, Daria. Thanks very much. Okay, and Tony, you're good to kick people off? Yeah, okay, so Tony's giving me the thumbs up. So you'll be invited now to your groups, and we'll see you back here in 12 minutes or so. So feel free, while we're just waiting for the last one or two to come in, feel free to write any comments you want or questions you want in the chat box as well. And we'll have a chance to answer them. And I hope you enjoyed the groups. Thanks, Kieran did. It's quite nice to be able to chat to people. I think in person, when we run these courses, these ethics courses, some of the best stuff is in the groups where you get to really go into the ethical conundrums you come up with during the week, you know, things that you would have felt perfectly fine about before. You kind of think, oh God, what's the ethics of that, you know? And I think that's a really good thing, actually. People tend to enjoy that, actually, as they become more sensitive to, you know, living well in the world rather than just living, you know, on autopilot, you could say. Okay, I think we're all back. So if you have any questions, do pop them in the chat box. And hopefully you enjoyed the group there and chatting to each other. So let's push on, and I'll stop again if there is questions, because I know it takes a little bit of time to write them in as well. There's a bit of appreciation coming in from Kathy and Mairead about the groups. That's great. Okay, so again, to remind you, last week we looked at the guidelines, the ethical precepts. So we're working through the 10 precepts, and we'd worked through the body and the mind, sorry, the body and the speech precepts. Now, there's 2 different lists of guidelines. So one list is the 5 precepts, which I mentioned last week or last time, were practiced mainly in a way by lay folk, but we tend to practice them everywhere in the Buddhist world. And the other one was the 10 precepts, which normally in the East you practice as a monk or a nun, and we take them on as ordained members, but you can practice them as well. So it's a little complex, but the fifth one of the 5 is not in the 10, if you see what I mean. So we're actually going to look at 4 different mind precepts now. Don't worry if the maths isn't clear. So let me just share my screen. So let me just make sure. Yeah. Okay, so there's 5 ethical guidelines in one list, and we've covered the first 4. So not causing harm or practicing loving kindness, not taking the not given or practicing generosity, not causing harm in our sexual relationships or practicing stillness, simplicity, contentment, not causing, the 4th one is not speaking untruthfully or practicing truthfulness. And then the 5th one of the 5 precepts is oh, sorry, that's wrong. Let me just come out of that. So the 5th one of the 5 precepts is avoiding intoxicants. Let me just I don't know how that slipped through earlier on. Now, so let me go back to Zoom and share that screen again. So the 5th one then, in terms of the mind, is practicing avoiding intoxicants or practicing mindfulness. So there's lots of different things that could be considered an intoxicant in Buddhism. So the traditional ones that you would think of are probably, you know, alcohol and drugs and so on. But an intoxicant is anything really which you use to cloud your mind, which you use to get away from your experience. So you could say an intoxicant could be anything like alcohol, drugs, it could be television, it could be computer games, it could be Netflix, it could be shopping, it could be the mindless browsing of Amazon for the recommended products that they think you'll like, you know, that kind of thing. All those things are powerful intoxicants. And the reason we use them is because we want to get away from our experience a lot of the time. Music, someone has just mentioned to me, music can be an intoxicant in some ways. I mean, let's come back to that one actually, because that's an interesting one. But modern society, it might not be an intoxicant as well. Modern society offers us an almost infinite number of ways of distracting ourselves from our experience, yeah? And the key thing to remember is that a lot of these things, most of these things probably aren't bad in and of themselves, yeah? So there's nothing particularly wrong with shopping. There's nothing particularly wrong with watching television or Netflix or whatever. Like the argument about whether drugs are useful or not, or alcohol, you know, it's not completely clear. So I'll let you work that out yourselves. But really what this precept is saying, what this guideline is saying, is that if you are indulging in intoxicants, it'll have an effect on your mind. Yeah, it'll have an effect on your mind. So if you have 3 pints of beer tonight after you finish the course, or a bottle of wine or something, you'll wake up in the morning, and if you're a meditator like many of us are, your meditation won't be as good. You know, you'll be sitting there feeling a bit grubby, feeling a bit dull, feeling a bit ill, and so on. So that intoxicant has consequences. Yeah. Or if you stay up late tonight on YouTube, you know, the endless YouTube algorithm that moves you on from video to video to video, and you end up watching YouTube or Netflix or television or whatever till 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock. Well, you're going to be wrecked tomorrow, or you're going to be more tired, certainly, you know? So that has an effect on you. That has a consequence on you. So this guideline is not saying that this is bad. It's more just saying that your actions have consequences. And often I think we take too short-term a view on what's truly enjoyable. Yeah. So if you really took in the hangover the next day of the bottle of wine, you'd probably be less inclined to drink the bottle of wine, you know? When I first learned to meditate, I stopped drinking, and it wasn't an ideological perspective, and I stopped smoking dope as well, marijuana, which I used to in college. And it wasn't an ideological position. It was more just that I really noticed it the next day when I'd been smoking or drinking, that my meditation was really poor. And so the pleasure-pain ratio, you know, the pleasure that you get from the intoxicant wasn't equal to the pain or the negatives on the other hand. So I think what this precept is asking you to do is to weigh up, where does pleasure really lie? Yeah, where does pleasure really lie? Does it actually make you feel better to wander like a hungry ghost on Amazon for the next big thing that's going to try and make you happy, you know, and so on and so on. So that's really what the guideline is about. So to come back to someone's question, can music be an intoxicant? I think we shouldn't confuse it doesn't necessarily, this precept doesn't necessarily mean exhilaration or deep enjoyment. That doesn't necessarily mean it's an intoxicant. I mean, if you're using music to get away from life, to get away from a deeper experience of life or your own experience, then it might be an intoxicant. But at the same time, music is also a pathway to beauty, which is very much a part of the spiritual and the ethical life, you know. So I don't think you can simply say that music is or isn't an intoxicant. A lot of the times our intoxicants are used, Subhadra Mati points this out in their book, a lot of times our intoxicants are used as an effort to relax, to switch off. You know, we're working all day at our computer, we come home from work, or we're, you know, the kids finally go to sleep and we're wrecked, you know what I mean? And we want to come down from a more agitated state to a calmer state. So we slump onto our phones, and I do this myself as well a lot. And Subhadra Mati makes the point that it's probably more useful, instead of thinking of turning off your mind, of going deeper into your mind. So what I think she's a lovely image in her book where she talks about how, you know, we're at the end of our day, perhaps we're on the surface of the sea of our mind, and it's very choppy and churned up and so on. But actually, if we think in terms of trying to go underneath the waves into something more deep, it's a better metaphor than trying to turn off the waves, you could say. So what we need to do really, and it's a bit counterintuitive when you feel like at the end of the day, is really probably to try and just do a body scan or something, or try and really feel more deeply into your experience. So it's not just the surface level of your mind blowing you around, and doing that instead of reaching for an intoxicant. Yeah. So think about going deeper rather than switching off. And of course, this ties in very much with the positive aspect of this guideline, which is clear and radiant mindfulness. So we try and practice clear and radiant mindfulness. So we try and be as aware as we can. We try and, in a warm kind of metaphor way, a warm awareness, not a cold, stark awareness. You know, it's a warm, connected awareness that we're looking for. Yeah, and obviously when we're mindful, we can change our world. When we're really mindful of something, when we're really taking things in around us, we live in a very, very different world. You know, when you're in your head worrying about something versus when you're really being aware of what's going on around you and you have an appreciation for that, you might as well be in a different world in some ways, you know. So mindfulness is really powerful. So the real questions coming out of this guideline is, where does pleasure really lie? You know, where do you want to find real pleasure, deeper pleasure, enjoyment of life? And Buddhism is really clear. We should really enjoy things. You know, we should really appreciate things. Pleasure is a good thing, but it just says that a lot of what we think of as pleasurable really isn't that pleasurable when you look at it. Yeah. So the state of mind that alcohol leaves you in, or hours of Netflix leaves you in, is not a pleasurable state of mind, you know? And watch out, how do you distract yourself? How much do you want to distract yourself from your experience? It doesn't mean, by the way, that you can't drink as a Buddhist or anything like that. So, you know, on my holidays last week, I had a glass of wine here or there, but if I was out for dinner. But it does mean that, like, I know very few Buddhists who would drink to excess, and they would find it very painful to drink to excess because of the payoff you would pay the next day. And actually, even after like being on holidays for a few days and, you know, having 1 or 2 glasses of wine over the week, I just feel like, oh, okay, I've done that now for a while. You know what I mean? I'm looking forward to sharpening up my meditation again now, you know, and things like that. It definitely has an effect on you. And I think it probably has more of an effect than we realize. Okay, so that's the ethical guideline, which is avoiding intoxicants and practicing mindfulness. So if you have any questions, do send them in. Subhadra Mati has a really good practice suggestion for this week, and I'll read it. It's on page 82 of the book. She says, look at how you relax. Here are some suggestions for exchanging activities that tend to cloud and coarsen the mind for activities that tend to clarify and uplift the mind that you could practice over the next week or two. So intoxicants tend to cloud and coarsen your mind, make it more rough. So she's looking at ways that might not do that and instead uplift us and clarify our minds. So she suggests, spend one evening reading a classic novel instead of watching television. So, or indeed Netflix or whatever or YouTube or whatever your intoxicant is. That's one. At least one evening this week. A bit like when people are promoting vegetarianism, they say have one day where you're vegetarian. Well, maybe one evening where you read a book instead of being on a screen. Not sure if this one will work right now, but she says, bring a volume of poetry to read on the subway or bus instead of a free newspaper that's given out to you. So maybe read a book instead of being on your phone, maybe, or reading a crappy newspaper that's just full of alarmist stuff to make you ultimately buy more stuff. Instead of having a glass of wine to relax, listen to a meditation CD. So you could try that out. Instead of surfing the web on your phone in your lunch break, try eating your sandwich mindfully, tasting every bite without doing anything else. So you could try that out. Try eating one meal on your own this week where you taste every bite without being on a screen. So that could be a really interesting thing to do. Walk around the park instead of walking around the shops. Well, and in a way, we can't really walk around the shops very much at the moment. So, but anyways, there are some practice suggestions that you'll find in your book. And I think it would be quite good if one of those struck you to really take them on this week and see if you want to even just practice one. I think a lot of the time it's realizing that the pleasure lies more in mindfulness and so on. Yeah. Okay, so that's the 5th of the 5 precepts. Do send in any questions if you have them. So then the next ones, so let me just share the screen again. The next 3 then are the 10 guidelines, or the precepts 8, 9, and 10. So these correspond to greed, hatred, and delusion. And there's this image now on the screen of a pig, a cock, and a snake. And if you've ever seen an image of the Tibetan Wheel of Life, it's this big kind of complex image, which is said to be a mirror for our minds. But at the heart of this, it's not a mirror for the fullness of our minds. It's a mirror for how the worldly mind works, you could say. The mind that's very not enlightened, you could say. The mind that causes us suffering, you could say. And at the heart of this wheel, that turning wheel, is greed, hatred, and delusion. The pig, the cock, and the snake. And these are all biting each other's tails and feeding off each other. So it's quite a visceral image. I can't remember which is which, I must confess. There are some of the metaphors and images you get from the East are a bit counterintuitive for our Western mind. I mean, you could imagine that the snake is probably hatred. I think the cock is greed and the pig is delusion, but don't quote me on that. But anyways, we're not being anti-animal or anything like that, but it's just an interesting metaphor or image to have at the center of the wheel of life. So the last 3 ethical guidelines to do with the mind, each of them have one of these: greed, hatred, and delusion. They're tackling greed, hatred, and delusion in the mind. And in a way, these drive the whole of unenlightened existence. These are the cause of all suffering in the world, according to the Buddha: greed, hatred, and delusion. So in a way, it all comes back to the mind. And the quality of your mind determines the quality of your world that you live in, you could say, the world that you experience. So these are the 10 precepts. So yes, I got them right there. I think Tony's just sent me through a message. So the first of the mind precepts is abstaining from covetousness. So covetousness is how it's put normally, but you could understand it as greed as well. So covetousness is probably a bit more accurate in some ways, in that covetousness is reaching out for something to fill an inner gap, usually an inner existential gap. So that's what covetousness is in this context. It's trying to get something, to make it part of you, to make yourself feel whole or complete. Yeah. And the thing is that it's actually impossible to fill an existential gap with something external to you. So it's actually painful. It's actually painful. And in the world, you know, we're offered so many things that we're told will make us happy, will fill that existential gap, even if it doesn't use that language typically. So almost all modern day marketing, at least for consumer goods and so on, is probably built upon that premise that you're selling a way of life to people. You're selling something that will make them feel really good about themselves. Yeah. So I'm a bit of a tech junkie. So for me, Only yesterday I was reading about this new phone that has come out, that I really should replace my phone with, even though my existing phone's completely fine. And if I only had that thing, the story goes, I would be happy. I'd feel complete. It would make me have this toy that I could play with. That would make me really, really happy. The reality is I'd probably enjoy it for a couple of days, 3 or 4 days, maybe a week. And then it would just be the same as my old phone, and I'd be a bit frustrated. And then I'd probably drop it and scratch it and get really upset and things like that. So, a lot of modern consumerism is based upon covetousness. I was in Tesco the other day, and I was getting some breakfast porridge actually, and there's shelves in this Tesco of a breakfast cereal called Crave, which is mainly, as far as I can see, sugar and chocolate. So in a way, it's a perfect metaphor for the wider human experience at times, So the counterpart then is tranquility or non-attachment. So I think tranquility is a better word, because non-attachment can sound too cold. It's perfectly normal to have people that we're attached to, actually. It's perfectly normal to love people. But what we're talking about here is a kind of a sticky attachment. So it's a real question in the spiritual life that there's no easy answer for. How can we love people without the sticky attachment? How can we care about a cause, for example, without holding it so tightly as to make us unhappy? And this is a real question. How can we love people without getting attached to them? And we talked about this a little bit last time when we were talking about the not causing harm in our sexual relationships. It does seem to me that the less attached you are to someone, the better the relationship goes. And that's true of romantic partners. It's true of friendships and so on. It's true of family members. I mean, I'm not a parent myself, but I can see in my sisters how hard it is at times, and my brother as well, when kids start to grow up and you have to let go of them, and let them live their own lives as well. So I think it is possible to really deeply love people without a sticky and neurotic attachment to them as well. I'm not saying that's easy though, and I'm not saying I've mastered that myself. But Subhadramati talks about how we can reflect that, imagination can be really good, that, everything is going to end at some point. So we have to let go of things. We have to hold things lightly. It's not to say we can't appreciate and really invest our energies in our connections with people. But you have to be a little careful reflecting that all things end, so that you don't get into nihilism or depression. But another way of putting it, I find this more useful, is seeing everything in the bigger context of your bigger ideals. So when I get very attached to something like the next phone, or really needing this thing to be happy, I think of the Buddha, actually. I think of a life lived really simply, where he was deeply happy. He could see the impermanence of things and see that things wouldn't make him happy. So when I think of the bigger context, sometimes I think I'm getting so worked up over this thing, and actually in a year's time, it'll be broken, or I could be dead, or whatever, and that does actually help if you do that with enough positivity. Another thing that's really good to do is to travel, although we can't really do that right now. But I remember I've been on pilgrimage to India, to the places where the Buddha gained enlightenment and so on. And you see just how different existence is over there. I'm sure many of you have been to India or other countries. It doesn't even have to be that they're very poor countries, it's just that they're very different, So you just see how people can live very differently to us, and how the lifestyles that we take for granted and what we need are just assumptions on our part, and actually we could live very differently. Or I think of some people in our order, the stories of people in our order who, they just give away all their possessions and they're free, and they feel really happy about that, So I'm not quite sure I'm ready for that yet, but it is good to have our views about what we need challenged at times. And do we really need all the stuff we think we need? And can we reflect and appreciate the things that we do have? Yeah. So tranquility is a really deeply positive state of mind. It's a state of mind where we feel happy just as we are. We're not always reaching beyond ourselves to something to fill that gap, and something that can't fill that gap anyway. So it's quite, I think the mind precepts are really profound, actually. They're really deep and really profound. So the idea of not needing something outside yourself to be happy, that's something to reflect upon. That's really, I think, quite profound. I mean, it's not just Buddhism that says that. All major religions would talk like this as well. But for me, I think the Buddha really brought out, really brought out the fact that it cannot make you happy in a really interesting way. Okay, so if you have any questions on that's the 8th of the 10 precepts, to abstain from coveting things, from covetousness, and to practice tranquility. So we'll do a reflection now, just so I'm not talking all the time at you. So let's do a reflection. So why don't we set ourselves up just to sit comfortably. Closing your eyes when you're ready. And maybe again, taking a deeper breath or two down into your belly, just so you're in your body. And just notice, you can stay in touch with the breath if you want, or you can let it go, but notice what you can see if you have your eyes open, or what you can hear. What you can taste, what you can touch, what you can smell. And really, life is extraordinary. The fact of being alive is extraordinary. Even if your life is difficult and challenging at the moment, at least we have life, at least we have awareness. We have this awareness that can be aware of different things, aware of sights, sounds, smells, tastes, touches. This magical quality of awareness of the mind. That we could easily not have. And we live in an incredibly fortunate place in the world and in history. I know things are difficult with COVID, but at the same time, we have in general in our lives in Ireland, in wherever you are, right now, a time and place of unprecedented wealth and freedom. Even if we're not particularly well off, we probably still live more healthy and longer lives than medieval kings. So bringing to mind the material things that we benefit from, such as the food we eat, the shelter we enjoy, the house we have, the house we dwell in. Even if those things aren't completely perfect, they do sustain us. And asking yourself what else there is in life to be grateful for. Maybe your family, your friends. We have them around. And then there are all the cultural riches that we enjoy, our education and schooling, art, books, films, music. And there might be teachers that have been particularly helpful to you in your life. And are there any other blessings you can think of? Anything or anyone that has enriched your life? So I want you to pick, just maybe to summarize that into 3 to 5 things, 3 to 5 of these blessings, you might say, these things to feel grateful for in your life. Pick at least 3. And just summarize them into words or sentences. And just tuning in then to how you feel after having done that. Tuning into any feelings of tranquility and appreciation for what you have. And does that feel different to wanting things, craving things? How does it feel different? And then bringing the practice to a close when you're ready. And opening your eyes in your own time. Okay, so feel free to write anything there in the comments about how that exercise was. One of the things I'd like you to do this week is I'd like you to keep a gratitude journal. Yeah. Now, I don't know if I've put this in the homework. If not, I'll add it to the homework. But if you really want to have a sense of contentment and appreciation and tranquility, I think. A gratitude journal is a really good way of going about that. So what a gratitude journal simply means is that at the end of each day, you have your notepad beside your bed, you pick it up and you write down into it 3 things that you're grateful for that day. Yeah, 3 things that you're grateful for that day. And it's a really good way of moving if you have a slightly, well, melancholic disposition to a more appreciative disposition. I have very close friends who have done this practice for years, and it has transformed how they tend to look at the world. So I'd really recommend that as a practice over the coming week. Hopefully you have your little notebook that I've been talking about for a few weeks now. But I'd really encourage you to do that, particularly if you enjoyed that exercise there and found it useful. Yeah. So Kieran's saying that I feel a lot more grateful for the richness in my life. Yeah. So that's what that exercise does. We have so much, and yet we're all a lot of the time unaware of it. We're always told to look for what we don't have, and yet we have so much already. Yeah. There's the story of the Buddha and the king. So the Buddha met a king. I can't remember which king it is off the top of my head now, but the king said he must be the happiest person in the whole of India or the whole of the world because he has everything he needs, you know. And he said, I bet I could sit for an hour and be completely contented. And well, he's chatting with the Buddha, and the Buddha said, can you sit for an hour and be completely contented? And the king thought, yeah, I could. I think I could. He said, could you sit for 3 hours and be completely contented? And the king was like, maybe, yeah. And then could you sit for a whole day and be completely contented just sitting there? And the king said, no, I probably couldn't do that. And the Buddha said, I could probably sit a whole week. I could sit a whole week and just be completely contented with just sitting there taking in the world. That's how contented I am and happy I am. So the king had to acknowledge that the Buddha, who had nothing except a couple of, you know, dusty old robes and a food bowl and maybe a little bit of medicine, was happier than he, the king, who had everything. Okay, so that's the guideline and the precept on covetousness. So do feel free if you wish to send in any comments or questions on that. Okay, maybe what we should do now is we'll take a short break, a comfort break. So why don't we come back and be ready to go for just before 8:10. So it's 4 minutes past 8 now, my clock. So why don't we come back and be ready for 9 minutes past 8, okay? And we'll kick off, we'll continue then. Great. Okay, so just before we go into the second half and finish off the ethical guidelines, just to remind you about the, you can see all of our events coming up. I didn't mention this in the last precept, I forgot to mention it, but going on retreat is a great way too of moving away from covetousness and practicing tranquility. So it's where you just go live a really simple life typically. Normally you go off somewhere, but we are starting our summer retreat next week on Sunday. So I'd really encourage you to come along on that if you want. I mean, each day has a full day's program from Sunday to Sunday, but you can do what you're able to do. You can't just do what you're able to do. I mean, not everyone will be able to come to all the events, obviously, but there's morning meditation, there's teaching meditation. If you haven't done meditation with us before, there'll be talks every evening, there'll be discussion groups and so on. There'll be Slack channels for if you know what Slack is, to communicate with people throughout the day if you want to, and so on. We're really looking forward to it, and it's going to be quite a big event. There's already about 200 and I think we're close to 300 people from Dublin and Ireland doing it, and there's another 350 or 400 people in the London Buddhist Centre doing it, and there's a few hundred people more from around the UK. So it'll be a big event, quite exciting. So if you want to be part of that and get on retreat, do come to that. You'll see all these events on. You'll see it on our website, dublinbuddhistcentre.org/online, or even just dublinbuddhistcentre.org. And again, if you're in a position to donate, if you can donate, please do go to dublinbuddhistcentre.org/donate. Tony's just sharing the links now in the chat. Or you can go to paypal.me/Dublin Buddhist Centre. That's a really quick way to give. You can give in 2 minutes. You might like to consider also the standing order, which you can do with the first donation link. If you're in a position to do so, that would be really helpful for us. So thank you for that. Okay, so and maybe Tony, could you share the link for the summer retreat as well if people want to click it open and leave it open in the background while we go on? If you can get that from the website, that would be great. Okay, so the next thing then is we'll move back to the precepts. So the next guideline then, just two more mind ones to get through, remember. The next one is, if the first one was about greed, this one is about hatred. So abstaining from hatred and practicing compassion is the next one. So trying to move away from hatred and trying to practice compassion. So it's said in Buddhist psychology that covetousness, greed, is the reaching out for something to fill that gap. Hatred is what happens when something gets in the way of that, or something that you think you need to be happy is taken away from you. So greed is the reaching out of something for something, and hatred is the response when that gets blocked or hindered in some way. So this can be a person or a thing, and hatred is that desire to destroy that thing that gets in the way of what we want, you could say. Yeah. And what we want might simply be not to have that person here because they're annoying or whatever, or they're threatening. So hatred is everything from mild irritation to resentment to passive aggressiveness to blame to righteous indignation to murderous rage. Yeah, so it's a whole spectrum of things. Most people probably don't do murderous rage, I hope, although everyone does, I think, from time to time, probably. But certainly mild irritability, resentment, that kind of thing would fall into the category of it. You could even be schadenfreude, if you know that, taking pleasure in the misfortunes of others. And even low self-esteem can be a form of hatred, of self-hatred as well, where you think your hatred is directed towards yourself. So you just think that you're a really awful person and so on. That's a species of hatred as well, which Buddhism says is not helpful and is actually useless and needs to be gone beyond. So the main thing with hatred, the main thing to start off with is to realize that it's destructive. It's not helpful. And I think this is very difficult to realize when you're in hatred or anger, because it's very seductive. You feel powerful, or you feel you're in touch with your energies. But actually, even the milder forms of hatred, like irritability, are actually destructive. And hatred is seen as one of the most destructive emotions in Buddhism, completely opposite to spiritual growth. It's said to be seen as, well, it's said to be worse than greed. An advanced practitioner can get away with greed much more easily than hatred, because hatred is so relational. It can really damage your relations with other people much more so than greed can. In some ways, people who are greedy are often quite fun to hang out with, because they know where all the best things are. They know where the best parties are, so to speak. They know where the best restaurants and cafes are. You know what I mean? But it's not really pleasant to be around people who are really, really angry and hateful. Also, the thing about hatred is that when you dwell upon it, it can grow and really poison things. So Bhadramati talks in the book about an example where she encourages, what she does is she's trying to explore what hatred feels like. And as she gets people back into an experience of when they're experienced hatred, the room starts to become really heavy and unpleasant, and everyone starts to get argumentative and so on. So she never did that exercise again. Yeah, and the other thing about hatred is that it tends to narrow down our attention. So we tend to get into this very polarized state of you here and your enemy there, and your main function is to protect yourself and to destroy the enemy. And you see this particularly in online communication, online forums and so on. Or indeed, if you're working with someone who you just find difficult, it's very easy for their existence just to narrow down to the source of all pain in your life, the source of all difficulty in your life. And it's easy to scapegoat people and make them really just dwell upon how much you dislike them, So it's a difficult emotion. I mean, none of us probably relish hatred, but yet it's an emotion we can do a lot. And the Buddha, I think I quoted this before in previous weeks, but the Buddha was very clear. He said, "Not by hatred are hatreds ever pacified here in the world. They are pacified only by love. This is the eternal law." So I'll read that again. He says, "Not by hatred are hatreds ever pacified here in the world. They are pacified only by love. This is the eternal law." And in thinking about this myself, I think that when have I ever sorted out difficulty with someone by being more and more argumentative? Anytime I've ever sorted anything out with someone, it's always been through give and take. It's always been through trying to compromise and see the other person's position. It's never been by winning. Winning just makes people resentful. Yeah. And it also isolates you if they're resentful then. So it's only ever pacified by love. Yeah, that's the eternal law. And in a different position, in a different story, the Buddha says that even if you're grabbed by bandits and they held you down and chopped you in half, I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, didn't I? There's no call for hatred. It's not that you wouldn't reason with them to stop you trying to do it, or you might even try and escape, but the emotion of hatred, the volition of hatred is never called for, and it's corrosive, And the other image that the Buddha gave, although I've never been able to track this one down, is that when you do hatred for someone, it's like reaching into a burning hot fire to pull out a burning coal to throw at them. Yeah. So you burn yourself before you even get anywhere near them. So when you hate someone, in a way, you're negating their being. The positive counterpart is compassion. So compassion is the recognition that other people are as real as we are. We've talked about this already. It's loving kindness. It's having a desire for their well-being. It's this kind of resonance we feel with all of life around us when we're being most true to ourselves. So you've probably heard me talk already in this course about doing the metta bhavanam, or the loving kindness meditation practice. So if you don't know how to do that, do learn it from a meditation course. The meditation course that I finished a few weeks ago is online if you want to watch it, or come on the retreat next week and we'll be exploring it in great depth. So loving kindness is a really important, it's compassion basically here. That's the antidote to hatred. And you might remember that exercise we did a few weeks ago where we put ourselves in someone else's shoes and imagined what it was like to be them. And a lot of people talked about how it made it lessened their own dislike for the person, or it made it a lot more easy to understand them. And I think that's the essence of compassion, just seeing another person as real, So anyways, that's the guideline, that's the precept from the Buddha, moving away from hatred in whatever form and trying to instead cultivate compassion instead. And we won't do Subhadra Mati's practice suggestion, but it's just trying. It's on page 88. You could try it out yourself, but really it's a version of the metta bhavana, the loving kindness meditation, if you know that already. If you don't know that, you could try that practice suggestion on page 88, which is a meditation called Changing Hatred to Compassion. Yeah. Okay, so the last of the mind precepts then, and again, do send in questions because I don't like talking all the time here. If you have questions, do send them in. So the last of the mind precepts then, let me just share the screen again. Is to do, so we've had greed, we've had hatred, and now we have delusion. So this one is put a little bit differently, but what we're trying to do is abstain from what are called false views, and instead we're trying to practice wisdom. Yeah, so we're trying to abstain from false views, and we're trying to practice wisdom instead. Now, this false views needs a little bit of explaining. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what the Buddha meant about views. So a view is a way of seeing the world, yeah? There are ways that we make sense of the world. So we receive so much information in through the senses, and ideas occur to us and memories occur to us and all that kind of thing. We're always under a deluge of information from the world. So views are ways we make sense of the world. They're stories that we can tell ourselves about good and bad, useful and not useful, about the world and our place in the world. Yeah. So that's what I've just said. There's stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves and the world, and they're usually they're not disinterested. We get attached to the stories. So a major story would be that might be that I am the center of the universe. That would be a story that we might tell ourselves. I am the center of the universe. Another story and it would be easy to see how we get attached to that story, because it makes us feel important, it makes us feel special, and so on. And in some ways, you're the center of the universe, and that you're the center of your universe, but you're not the center of the universe. I mean, obviously we know that at some level, but at a deeper level, that's the story we tell ourselves. A very, very deep story that. So views aren't always, you know, they're not conscious thoughts. They're deeper stories that we tell ourselves, woven into our being, you could say, and that we get very attached onto. And yeah, let me come back to that again. So other examples of stories are, you know, just neutral stories like the sky is blue. You know what I mean? That's a story that we have, because we can never really tell if the sky is blue. All we have is what we interpret. But it's, you know, it's a reasonably neutral story. But other stories that we have that might not be so helpful are, if I have this thing, if I just have this thing, I'll be okay. If I can just meet that kind of person, I'll be okay. Or another story might be, I'm a bad person. I'm a bad person, you know? Or another story we can tell ourselves it would be something like, things will stay like this forever. I will always feel like this. So all of those are what you might call views or stories, and they're wrong views according to Buddhism. So, you know, the story, if I just have this thing or this person, I'll be okay. Well, we've already looked at how nothing outside of yourself can truly and deeply make you happy. It can help you be happy, but true happiness ultimately has to come from within. I'm a bad person, the other one I mentioned. Well, that's just not true. We'll come back to that a bit more later next week. But everyone changes. Everyone is changing all the time. So it's more accurate to say that you're probably a person who does things that are helpful at times and other things that are unhelpful at times. And the other story I mentioned, or the other view, things will stay like this forever. That's a wrong view, because things change all the time. It's one of the most fundamental principles of Buddhism. So we can have helpful views and unhelpful views. And what we're trying to do here is move away from unhelpful views and try and have helpful views. So a critique that we have of our stories, of our views, is, do they lead to greater freedom, or do they lead to greater entanglement with the complexities of the world? So do the stories we have lead to greater and greater freedom? So we need to let go of stories that are based upon greed and hatred, the previous ones, the covetousness and hatred. And we need to base our ways of looking at the world more on compassion and tranquility and wisdom. Yeah. So right views are based upon the truth, you know. Yeah, they're views that help us to become more free. So a right view might be something like, it's really important to be ethical. Yeah, it's really important to be kind. That's a story you have about the world. That's a really helpful one. Yeah. I mean, there's so much that could be gone into in this. Like the Buddha talked a lot about views, and there's so much that could be said. And even something that's a right view, if you cling to it in the wrong way or get really narrow around it, can be a wrong view then. It can turn into a wrong view. So it's important that you meditate every day. But if you go around then berating everyone for not meditating every day, you're probably got into a wrong view then, because it's how you emotionally, it's the emotion underlying it that dictates it. You've become very tight around it. It doesn't lead you to freedom. It leads you to be more of a meditation policeman that's quite unpleasant, you know? Sometimes you see this on retreat where, you know, we have a rota, and I have friends of mine who freely admit afterwards that they just get into making sure everyone's done their duties on retreat. And in a way, it's a good thing, because you want people to do their rota duties, but actually they just get really obsessive about it. And it becomes really unhelpful, and it becomes a wrong view, you could say, that everyone must do their duty. Sometimes people don't have to, you know. Anyways, so there's a lot more that could be said, but keep looking at the stories you tell yourself about things. So when you're having an experience of something unpleasant, what's the story you're telling yourself around this? And often it's something like, I don't deserve this, or I wish I would be happy if this would just go away, or I deserve this pain, or whatever it is. And often by changing the stories, by letting go of the stories, we'll improve our situation. Yeah. So here's the questions to ask. Does this story lead to greater freedom or less freedom? Does it lead to greater happiness or less happiness? Does it agree with the fact that things change all the time? Does this story tend to make us more self-preoccupied or less self-preoccupied? Is this story helpful or unhelpful? So we need to keep watching our views, keep watching our stories. And again, the Buddha talked about this endlessly he talked about this. And ultimately, we move from wrong view to right view, but then we move from right view to what the Buddha called no view, where we don't have to have stories about the spiritual life anymore. We don't have to tell ourselves it's really important to be kind, because that's just how we feel anyway. So it's not a story anymore. It's just something, sometimes it's called perfect vision. We see the importance of being kind. We don't even have to think about it anymore. So we move from seeing things wrongly, wrong views, to right views, to just a lived experience of perfect vision. Anyways, just so much more that could be said there about views, but really important and really central. And in a way, everything else, every action you take, there's an underlying story about why you need to do that. Yeah, every action you take, there's probably an underlying story. So I'm here tonight because there's a story, which is a good story, that, or the good view, that I want to help communicate the Dharma to people. I want to communicate Buddhism in a way that will help make the world a better place. You're here tonight because you have a story that's worthwhile doing. So that's a good, helpful view, hopefully. You might also have a story that afterwards you feel a need to, I don't know, go and buy a bag of chips at the local chipper or something. But that might not be a good view. That might be just a view that, okay, I deserve this now because I'm feeling a bit, you know what I mean? And you have to watch out for that after a good Dharma course. I often on retreat, after a really good session of meditation and chanting, there's a cue for the toaster and the cornflakes, you know, because you're often put a bit more in touch with the existential situation, and it can be a bit uncomfortable at first. And you just try and fill it with food then, you know. So there's a story there. I need to fill this hole with food or whatever it is. So it's rarely conscious. It's rarely conscious, but it can be conscious. But it's a really interesting area, I think, to explore this kind of stuff. Yeah. So Badramati has a practice suggestion, and I'll get back to some. I see there's a couple of questions there. She says, a sure way to know if you're holding on to a view in a tight, dogmatic way is if you respond heatedly or get upset when it is challenged, or even if someone just disagrees. Over the next week, every time you notice yourself holding on to and defending a view or position, whether it's the best way to load the dishwasher, responding to climate change, or something of an existential nature, stop and ask yourself, why does this matter? Whatever the response is to that question, ask yourself again, why does that matter? And then, why does that matter? And keep asking yourself this and see where it takes you. And you might want to take some notes. So why does this matter? And it might be that it does matter, but I mean, I'm not saying that, you know, it's not important to load the dishwasher in the right way. And as I've said already, you know, I'm very much a passionate environmentalist and so on. And obviously existential situations are situations that you really need to reflect on. But you'll never lose out by asking why, what's the story here? In fact, you might come to an even better story. Yeah. Okay, so that's the mind precepts done. So you have all you need now to gain enlightenment after looking at those 10 precepts, including the last 3, which are the mind precepts. Couple of questions. So our comments. Kieran is saying that. Okay, that's an interesting one, Kieran. So Kieran was sharing his interest in Buddhism with someone who got on really great with him, but when he told him when Kieran told him about the passion, he's been completely ignoring him. And he feels like he's angry and upset. Yeah. So I don't know really what to say, Kieran. Sorry to hear that. That's a bit painful. It can be very strange in the modern world to say that you feel passionately about something. You know, you want to take a stand, an ethical stand, an idealistic stand on things. And it can make people very uncomfortable at times. And it might just be that people need a bit of time to get used to that. And certainly with my family, when I got into Buddhism, they were very, very concerned for me, and you know, just didn't know what was going on. And you know, I probably became a bit, you know, I don't know, maybe I was a bit evangelical about things as well. I don't know really, but I think people just need time to adjust to these new aspects of you that are emerging when you start to get into Buddhism and so on. Just give them time and patience and be kind. Tony's asking, and Kieran, if it's still an issue, do feel free to drop me a line as well. Obviously, we can chat separately. Tony, when someone is trying to abstain from intoxicants and go towards mindfulness, can we ever be too mindful or too aware, maybe in a narrow sense? Yeah, I think we can be, Sangharakshita sometimes calls this alienated awareness, where we kind of put on the blinkers and we only focus on a very narrow band of our experience, and we just get very narrow and dry. Yeah. So I think if you're going to abstain from intoxicants, you also need to move towards mindfulness and move towards beauty, appreciation and beauty. So you can't just become you can't just cut off large chunks of yourself. You have to feed those parts of yourself in other ways. So if you're not going to go drinking or whatever, have the fun that you have in a pub because you find it affects your meditation too much, well, you need to make sure that you can find fun somewhere else then, you know what I mean, in a different kind of way. You need to make, if you find that you get really stimulated by watching lots of I don't know, Netflix or something like that, maybe you need to keep your imagination going with books. Often it's more about refining your input rather than cutting completely off from things that you like doing. I think looking for beauty basically is the main thing, looking for pleasure and enjoyment, and true pleasure and enjoyment and beauty. Otherwise, if it's just a bit dour and a bit narrow, you're not going to do it for very long, and you're not going to be very happy, to be honest. And that's not really what we're talking about here. Okay. So how are we doing time-wise? Okay. Okay, so do pop in more questions if you want, because that's often the most interesting part. So the last thing that I want to talk about, and maybe what we'll do then is we'll do a bit more of a reflection at the end, or a bit of a sit. I'm aware I'm talking a lot when I'm in this format. Let me just set something up here again. Okay, so I won't say much about this, but you can read about it in the book, because Svadharmati talks in, I think it's the next chapter, chapter 5, about a deeper motivation. So the context for ethics is enlightenment, is becoming more free. And what we need is something beyond ourselves to commit to. So if you're a Buddhist, that would be the principle of enlightenment. If you're not a Buddhist, and that's completely fine, you do need to have a sense that your ethical practice can't just be about you becoming happier. Yeah. Even though that's really important, I think your ethical practice has to be something more than that. It has to be something around, there has to be some kind of bigger context, which for me is about helping all beings live in tune with reality, or helping people become more free and enlightened. Or it could be about making the world, well, it's a cliche, but I think it's a good one, making the world a better place, or feeling like your life is within the context of something much bigger, Anyways, we don't have loads of time to go into that, but you do need some kind of self-transcending ideal. So if that catches your interest, Subhadramati does talk about it a bit more in chapter 5. But what I really want to chat to, and you need to commit to that, commitment is vital. But what I really want to focus on for the rest of the time then is an aspect of mindfulness, which is called vigilance. Yeah. So the Buddha's last words, so the Buddha died at the age of 79 or 80 after living a long life in India, of wandering around India, communicating his teachings. And apparently he died of food poisoning. He ate some food that was not good, and he died in great pain. And although the pain never disturbed apparently his mental composure. But his last words when everyone was gathered around were, "All things are impermanent, with mindfulness strive on." So all things are impermanent, with mindfulness strive on. Now the actual word that he used for mindfulness, it was apramada. So that's this word, so here, sorry, apamada or apramada in Sanskrit. So this is Pali, apamada. And what it means is vigilance. So it means really look, it's the aspect of mindfulness which means you're always aware, you're always aware of the ethical quality of what you're doing, or the ethical quality of what you're focusing on, or where your actions might lead. It means also just being committed to the precepts, as I say above there. So what this aspect of mindfulness is it's not enough just to be aware. Yeah. It's not enough just to be aware of where your arms are, where your legs are. It's not enough to be aware of how your body is moving. It's not enough just to have a sense of purpose, which I've talked about in other courses as well. In terms of, that's an aspect of mindfulness. A big aspect of Buddhist mindfulness is knowing if it is ethically positive or ethically negative. Yeah, if it's skillful or unskillful. So when you're really vigilant, you notice, really quickly, I'm doing anger here. I'm doing ill will. I'm doing irritability, for example. And that's not a good thing to do. So I need to work with this. So if you're really vigilant, you will notice the states of mind that you get into and whether or not they're helpful. And if they're helpful, you'll tend to want to encourage them and deepen them. And if they're unhelpful, you'll want to try and move beyond them. So if you notice, if you're being really ethically vigilant, and what that means simply is just being mindful of what's going on internally and having an awareness of the ethical tone of them. If you're really vigilant, you'll notice, this is me craving here. And actually this craving isn't going to make me happy. So why don't I try and not do it? Why don't I go for a walk instead and clear my head, or something like that. Or why don't I read a book instead of watching Netflix? Because I know once I get on Netflix, I won't be able to stop until it's 2 a.m. in the morning. And if I read a book, I'll read for half an hour and then I'll fall asleep. That's ethical vigilance as well. So it's knowing the quality, the ethical quality of what's going on in your mind right now, but also it's knowing where your actions might lead if you go down a path. Yeah. So you know that if you get onto Netflix, you'll not be able to get off, so you don't get onto Netflix, for example. So the literal translation of the word is non-heedlessness. So being heedless means not paying any attention to consequences, I guess you could say. So you're being non-heedless here. And it's not a quality of mindfulness that's very much focused on when you come across secular explanations of mindfulness, but it's really, really important. It's impossible to be ethical without having some kind of vigilance about your mental states. Yeah, and there's all kinds of things that you could do here. So one example for me was when I started practicing was realizing that if I met my friends in a pub, I'd probably find it unpleasant in terms of either I'd have a drink and regret it, or it would cause friction because I wasn't drinking. So what I would do then, an aspect of my appramada was realizing, okay, well, maybe I could, of my vigilance was, why don't I try and meet them in a cafe instead at lunchtime rather than in the pub in the evening? You know what I mean? Or another one for me was when I visited my family back home in Roscommon, I'd become a spoiled teenager again who wanted to, not quite true tantrums, but almost, you know what I mean? So when I would go into those situations, I'd be very vigilant about how easy it was to go back to my 16-year-old self again, that kind of thing. So that's all vigilance that we need to do. So there's two things then that we're drawing out here. There's committing to practicing the guidelines, the ethical guidelines, the precepts, committing to an ideal, a self-transcending ideal. And that's said to be the kind of heart beating of our spiritual practice. But we need to be committed to observing and being vigilant about the precepts as well. And that's the blood flow, you could say. That's the image that's used. Yeah, so in a way, that's what we need to do. We need to commit to living an ethical life. We need to have a vision of why we need to do that. And we need to be really vigilant about making sure all of our actions then are in line with that. And sometimes I'm a bit wary of talking about vigilance in this way because it sounds exhausting. It sounds exhausting. It sounds like something we need to do all the time. But actually, vigilance is something we carry lightly in some ways. It doesn't actually, once you've built up any kind of momentum of mindfulness, which hopefully you will have by now, particularly if you've been meditating, or not even if you've been meditating, you've just been noticing your states of mind, it gets easier and easier to do. Yeah, Vigilance is something that isn't a strain. It's something, in one Buddhist text, it's called, it said that a Buddhist practitioner wears their vigilance as light as a feather. Yeah. So it's serious and it's light as well. It's not oppressive, this kind of vigilance, which I think I should say, because the idea of always being vigilant can sound a bit exhausting, yeah? But it's not like that, really. So again, Subhadramati has a practice suggestion, and it's on, let me just get the page here. Well, she talks about clarifying our values. So there's a really good exercise, which we can't do here due to the nature of it. Involves paper and pen, but you might want to look at it. She talks about writing down all the main aspects and activities in your life, and arranging, just arranging them in a way that brings out your values. And then in terms of the cultivating ethical vigilance, well, let's do that now, actually, because it's something that we can do, and then we'll come back to see if there's any questions. So let's just have a short reflection for five minutes or so now. So feel free to sit in any way you want, in meditation or not. Okay, let's think about the week ahead. Let's think about the week ahead and choose one event that you anticipate will be particularly challenging in terms of your ability to stay aware and positive. So an event that would be particularly challenging in terms of you being able to remain aware and positive. In particular, aware and positive enough to act out the ethical guidelines, to remain ethical. So it might be just that you'll be very busy with lots of meetings. It might be a difficult communication to have with someone. It might be a medical appointment you have to have. It might be any number of things in the week ahead. And ask yourself in the here and now, when this event comes around, are you just going to let yourself go? Or would you like to maintain and cultivate your ethical vigilance around it? Would you like to be able to maintain your positivity and awareness? So if you would like to cultivate your ethical vigilance and keep it in this situation, can you think of 3 things you could put in place that would support you when this challenging event comes around? 3 things you could put in place. And you might like to write these down if you're either now or afterwards. You might like to try and remember them clearly. So 3 things that would help you maintain your ethical vigilance, your positivity, your awareness in this situation. Things you could do beforehand, things you could do in the event itself, but really things you could put in place to support yourself beforehand. Okay, so you might like to bring that reflection to a close, and you might like to write those down so you remember to do them, or note them somehow. The other thing that she suggests is after the event, make the time to reflect again, and did your efforts to cultivate apramada help, and what did you learn? So that might be something you want to do as well. Yeah. So for me, it's like how to cope with the busyness of just back from being away. So I have lots of meetings in the next couple of days. So I was just thinking of ways to help me maintain my sanity throughout all those meetings, including maybe going for more walks, a walk each day and things like that around it. Anyways, so that's Subhadra Mati's practice suggestion for cultivating ethical vigilance. So I hope you find that useful. Okay, and someone has asked a question. So I was talking about how if your views are challenged, earlier on, I was saying, you know, why does this matter? And she's saying, what if this is a view you hold that is fundamental to you in regards to the well-beings of others? For example, what if someone says something racist or homophobic? How do you address that? Well, it is a difficult situation, and I think what maybe it comes back to not polarizing with the person. So you don't have to agree with someone. I'm thinking on my feet here now. I mean, I might have a better answer next week, but it feels important to stay in a relationship with the person if possible. You know, sometimes it's just not possible. Even the Buddha couldn't connect with some people, and they just you just have to say, no, there's nothing I can say to you that'll help, you know. But if you can, it feels less about engaging with the content and more about the connection with the person. And if you can be in connection with the person, they're much more likely to hear what you're trying to say. So I think what the teaching of like looking at your views here and why does this matter, I think what you're trying to let go of here is winning, you know, that which is the state I often get into, or proving that I'm right, and that never really works with people in my experience. So what works rather is connecting with people, and people are probably much more likely then to hear your point of view and realize what you're trying to say. So do it if only as a technique for winning. I'm being a bit facetious there, but you know what I mean. So it is a tricky situation, the person who asked that question, but you don't have to. It's not saying you have to agree with them or let them away, but it's about how you engage with them and how dialogue happens. It rarely goes well when you polarize strongly with people. So I think that's what we're trying to let go of. Okay, so you can send in more questions if you have them. Just about the home practice this week. So the home practice this week, what I want you to do is to read chapter 4 for next time. You could also read chapter 5 if you have time, but chapter 4 is the chapter that we've already been looking at with the ethical guidelines. And again, I'd really like you to look at your practice of the precepts again and pick one each day if you can, or if that's helpful. And do one of the reflections that Subhadra Mati has for each precept. So do at least one reflection every day is what I would ask you to do. Let's see what else, and record how you get on with all these in your notebook. I haven't put it in there. I will add it in the email about the gratitude journal as well. So you might want to write down every evening 3 or 4 things that you feel grateful for in the day you've just had. Yeah. So that is the home practice. I will send that out to you as well. So maybe what we could do, Tony, if you're happy to do this again, is maybe we could go back into the groups again for the same groups as before. I think they should automatically default. And maybe we could just take a minute each and share one thing we really want to do about the home practice in the week ahead. Does that make sense? So one thing, so you'll have about a minute each. So we'll go into the groups whenever Tony is ready to send us, and we'll call you back in 5 minutes, and then we'll bring the evening to a close. So I just want you to, it makes a difference when you decide something yourself to say to other people. So I want you to share it with the group, one thing you want to take away. I mean, you've got a fair bit of homework there, but maybe there's one thing this week you really want to take away. So off you go, Tony, when you're ready. Great. Okay, so I'll just put this, so that's pretty much it now. So I'll stop the recording and